and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to chapters 5 and 6 of Percy Jackson's The Lightning Thief. And yes, if you're wondering, I am repping Camp Half-Blood. I know I wore this for the Riordan video, but it finally makes sense now. You're finally seeing students in these bright orange shirts as Percy arrives in Camp Half-Blood. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's start with our summary before we get things in a little more depth. So, Chapter 5, Percy is in and out of consciousness for a while, meeting a few strange people, such as a man covered in a lot of eyeballs, and this girl who we have heard named Annabeth, and we'll have that name confirmed later in the chapter, who's taking care of Percy and feeding him, but also kind of interrogating him. Not that it's working, because Percy has no idea what's going on. When he comes to fully, he is sitting on the porch of a building, and Grover is there. Grover helps feed him a drink that tastes like chocolate chip cookies that his mother used to make. And unfortunately, we get a lot of things confirmed. Grover is a satyr. That Minotaur attack was real. Percy did kill the Minotaur, but lost his mother in the process. Grover has actually gone to the trouble of finding the horn that Percy tore off the Minotaur and used to kill him to return that to Percy. But Percy doesn't really have a chance to breathe here very quickly. Grover takes him around the porch to meet some more people, most notably Mr. D, the camp director, and also Mr. Brunner? Yes, it turns out Percy's Latin teacher is here. He invites Percy to sit down with them and play some pinochle, and also gives a few vague hints about it being a really long time since he's gone undercover to, get a student, and also, what is going on? Annabeth disappears, having been introduced properly here, going to check the cabin that Percy will be staying in, while Percy and Grover sit down to play pinochle with Mr. Brunner, Chiron, he insists, his proper name, and Mr. D. In this game, we discover quite a bit. First and foremost, the Greek gods are real, and also probably hate you, and also don't use their names. Percy isn't quite sure he believes this until Mr. D turns to him, having admitted that he's here as a punishment. He's not allowed to drink anymore, and has to watch the camp because he went after a wood nymph that his father, Zeus, forbid him to go after. And that's when Percy realizes, you're Dionysus. And Mr. D is not afraid to let Percy know he has that guess correct, and he could kill or drive Percy mad in an instant. Thankfully, though, Mr. D heads back off into the house, having lost the game of pinochle to Chiron, taking Grover with him in order to tell him off about the failure that he is at his job. Excellent. Well, Chiron reassures Percy that Mr. D doesn't hate Grover, he just hates his job. They have a bit of a longer conversation about the Greek gods and how they can still be alive. It turns out these Greek gods have been traveling across the earth. Every time the main center of power and culture switches from a country, the Greek gods go with it. That's why there is Greek styles and images of the Greek gods all across the world. And I sort of got curious about this one because you mentioned, Chiron challenges Percy to find a city that doesn't have some sort of Greek god representation. And I was like, And then I instantly remembered there is in fact a statue of Hermes in one of our local parks in my city. So, that's a good point. It turns out the gods travel around. It turns out Chiron's a centaur. He's got a horse's body hidden in his wheelchair. Information overload! Chapter 6. Chiron takes Percy off on a tour of the camp, though he doesn't explain a lot of things clearly. For example, Percy looks back at the building they've just left, which is the main house. There's 4 floors to it, but hey, a curtain in the attic just moved. Not that Chiron will explain it. He's also not willing to explain why Grover's in so much trouble. Well, Percy says he'll get a second chance, right? He did okay on this one. He got me here. Chiron does tell him this was his second chance, but he won't tell him about the screw-up of the first time. Just that Grover probably needs to rethink what he wants to do in life. But there's strawberry fields, because Mr. D can't grow grapes. Also, the woods is stocked, but you want to go in there armed, and this entire camp seems to be a lot of military focus. Fighting. Get ready for the fighting. Also, why doesn't the place we eat have a roof on it? Are you going to answer any of my questions? No? Okay, on to the cabins. The cabin section of Camp Half-Blood holds 12 cabins, each of which has a patron god belonging to it. Percy will piece this together, eventually. But some of the cabins are not used in. All of them are personalized by the campers, if they are being lived in. And Percy ends up getting dropped off with Annabeth outside of Cabin 11. Cabin 11 has the patron Hermes. I already mentioned him. Got a statue of him. Among other things, god of travelers. So Cabin 11 is forced to accept every visiting camper who is undetermined. Undetermined being code word that Percy doesn't find out here yet, but undetermined means we don't know the godly parent. And we might not know the godly parent. Before anyone in Cabin 11 can explain this, or Percy can embarrass himself any further, Annabeth does pull him out, telling him to shape up, because many of the kids here would have killed for his opportunity to defeat the Minotaur. Percy's just like, my mom died! Also, what the hell is going on? And right before Annabeth can then tell him the secret about the other parent, his father in this case, Clarice intervenes. And we get as close to a confirmation in this chapter that we can when Clarice is introduced as the daughter of Ares. It turns out everyone's here half-blooded. They're all demigods who have been born between a godly parent and a mortal parent. And Clarice is big girl of camp. So, time to beat up Percy. Percy recognizes that Annabeth can't intervene. He is the newbie, so he has to make his own rep. It turns out, though, he's probably not going to do so well when Clarice immediately gets him in a headlock, pulling him towards the girls' washroom to give him a swirly. But the toilets explode right at the right time, defeating Clarice and sending her out the door and soaking everybody but Percy in the bathroom, which does include the unfortunate Annabeth. Ultimately, Annabeth decides Percy should be on her capture the flag team, and Clarice decides Percy needs to die. Yes. Yes. No, I find this pair of chapters very interesting because we have sort of this adult side of things and then this really notable kids side of things. Though there is some crossover in both, because we get Grover at the start of chapter 5, and we do get Chiron at the start of chapter 6. But ultimately, we kind of have this information overload, and then this chapter that sort of confirms that everyone has their problems. There's still a, like, power hierarchy happening, and everyone's out to get what they want, but somehow at a different level. Like, giving somebody a swirly, like, that seems really childish and mundane in the face of the information that Percy's just gotten, which is the Greek gods are real and are out to kill your ass. Like, how else can you explain it? Ultimately, this pairing up of chapters works really well because it lets Percy actually ground himself again. He's sort of in this floating abyss of, I have no idea what is going on, until Clarice shows up. And then immediately Percy is just like, no, this is familiar. I'm new guy at school. You're top of the hill. And it's time for me to make my rep. Like, he immediately recognizes this. He immediately recognizes Annabeth cannot intervene. He actually hands her the Minotaur horn. It sort of says, like, you stay over there. And he suddenly knows exactly what's going on. Because it is this childish, mundane moment that he's been through ultimately 6 times before this. All of the changes of schools have led him to this moment of sudden, finally, something I know that I can handle. Even if it ultimately means he loses, which is what that moment is looking like when Clarice, like, immediately just... and Percy's just like, son of a... He at least understands what's happening there. Well, until the toilets explode. Because as much as we appreciate this grounding moment of, I can understand this, that moment does not erase all of the information that we just got. It actually just heightens how impossible it is to return to the mediocre and mundane. Because Percy might know what's happening, but the way he then ultimately fights back is this weird pull in his stomach that causes the toilets to explode. He can't explain that. He has no idea how that happened, that he didn't do it purposefully, but we're also getting then an echo of the very first chapter when Nancy Boba Fett ended up in the fountain, the water having apparently reached out and grabbed her. So we could tell moments like this are relatively normal for Percy, but we're on that twinge of uncomfortable, I don't have full control moments. Which is understandable after the sheer amount of just information we've been given prior to this point. Like, chapter 5 really is this information overload, but Riordan does it beautifully in, like, ultimately the worst way possible. Which is, Riordan sets up this conversation between Chiron, Mr. D, and Percy. Grover's there, but Grover is, Percy says later, understandably, minding his cards, chewing on a Coke can, and keeping his mouth shut. So this three-way conversation is one of those conversations that every kid knows about and hates. It is that type of conversation where the two adults know precisely what's going on, assume that you are grasping it a lot quicker than you are, and just aren't explaining things clearly. They're just jumping around, and you're just like, no, I want somebody to sit down and tell me from the beginning what is going on. Because rather than saying something like, the Greek gods are real, one of them is your parent. They ultimately hate each other, and in trying to destroy each other, will try and destroy each other's kids. There's a lot of monsters out there that regenerate, and they'll keep coming after you. You're a half-blood, you're probably gonna die painfully. Like, rather than set it out that plainly, they just keep talking circles around Percy. Like Chiron, Mr. Brynner, and never clearly explains what is going on, why he was at that school. Like, it's just little snippets because he has most of the information, so he doesn't think it's important to repeat. And Percy's just trying to, like, put it together, just like, okay, no, I think we had a different Latin teacher. But, like, it doesn't explain what you came to. What is going on? And it means, ultimately, that Percy's having difficulty getting information. And that he's making a judgment call based on that. Like, Mr. D is really rude and uptight and power hungry. Like, just demanding to be called sir. And Percy's like, I don't like this guy. A big part of that sets him off is the information that Mr. D has that he's not sharing. Like, he's the first character who actually calls Percy Perseus, his full name, which he is never told to anybody else. Chiron ends up using it as well, but it is Mr. D who does that first, and Percy recognizes it. Like, we get that statement Percy flinched at his full name, which he had not told anybody. So, Percy recognizes Mr. D has information that he's choosing not to share. Because that's what it looks like from Percy's position. Chiron and Mr. D might be looking at it like, you should have already figured this out by now. You should have had this explained to you. Like, Chiron even says, did your mother not explain this? Like, do you think I would be so confused if my mother had sat down and explained this? No, she didn't explain this. Also, she's dead. Somebody help me. But they're assuming he already knows this, and he's being purposely obtuse. And from his perspective, it looks to him like the adults know so much more information and are choosing not to share it with him. Especially Mr. D, who just is coming off as this person who doesn't like being here and is angry and is just taking it out on everybody else. Which is kind of what's happening in this moment. Except then, it starts to click for Percy. The first thing we can compare, again, is that power that Zeus has. So, again, Percy's recognition that these people are under the thumb of somebody bigger than them. This is going to become super critical in, the last series Rick Riordan's currently working on, which is the Apollo series. But we can see hints of it already. And Percy can see it. There's a point where Mr. D suddenly sounds like this kid who just feels like he's being punished unfairly. And suddenly Percy and Mr. D are a lot similar in that moment than they were before. And then Mr. D stomps on that because Percy figures out, you're Dionysus. And Mr. D turns to him and there's these purple flames in his eyes. And Percy is suddenly aware of the power that Mr. D has. And this is a weird one because Dionysus as a Greek god character has changed immensely. I am going to link to a video down below by Overly Sarcastic Productions, Red specifically, about her discussion of the characterization of Dionysus, Bacchus. All the different names he has, because there is a weird change in this character from this utterly destructive force that we see in something like the Bacchae, which is a tragedy, and then this utterly comedic, bumbling character of later discussions that we'll actually be seeing when we read the Frogs by Aristophanes. A massive change in characterization that is very, very interesting. So like I said, I'm going to link that video below. But in this moment, we clearly get the earlier Bacchic Dionysus. He is the one who will send vines to strangle you, who will send madness through your blood, who will rip you to pieces, who will change you into animals, and all of these really violent, dangerous, maddening things that shouldn't be possible. And that's Percy's introduction to the gods. He's already had the introduction to some monsters between the Fury that Mrs. Dobbs was and this Minotaur. And then the gods, like Mr. D is just like, remember your place. And Percy's just like, yes sir, okay. What just happened? Because we have this understanding that Dionysus is sort of low man on the totem pole here in comparison to Zeus, but he is immensely powerful and frightening if you put him in that position. And Percy's just kind of like, nothing I knew was true. What is really interesting then of having Percy have this realization that everything he thought was real wasn't, or isn't, or is at least different, is to then pair it up with that moment with Clarice at the end of the 2 chapters where he's like, this I can handle, but it's different still. Because being face down with Mr. D sort of very directly, but also in a safer environment, is this moment where Camp Half-Blood has to become the center of Percy's world. He has to sort of place himself first in some place that he vaguely understands, like the hierarchy of the newbie versus King of the Hill. But then he still has to adjust to all this new information. The big problem that Percy has to deal with, first and foremost, is where does he fit in all of this himself? Because everybody's going to try and tell him something, like Chiron puts him into cabin 11, and everybody is suddenly judging him for being undetermined. Including Annabeth, who's saying, like, you need to shape up because plenty of people would have wanted to defeat a Minotaur and you're just being an asshole, and you're just like, what? He has to sort of figure out real quick how he's going to exist in this new world and what he's going to do. Especially in recognizing that he is not as powerful as somebody like Mr. D or Zeus that he can hear thundering and lightning. But at least he's starting to understand some things. He's not as slow on the uptake as everybody's assuming he is. He has figured out that the gods are real. He's confused about it, but he's figured it out. He's figured out that all the lightning and thunder he's been hearing has been Zeus. So Percy is at a very awkward place right now. A lot has changed. His entire life has shifted on an axis where suddenly a lot of other things make a lot more sense, but it's still very confusing and now extra dangerous as well. And he has to sort of reset himself to this change of pace and deal with everything as it's coming at him now. Which is why I think that bathroom scene is really important. And always keep in mind that oftentimes the title of a chapter is really trying to draw your attention to the thing in the chapter that's important. But here it's very strange because it's pointing to the bathroom. Well, that could be Riordan's funny chapter names, but very notably, it's also Percy taking his first steps to understand where he is and what he's doing. So we're going to see how well he does the next few steps in that project while he's here at Camp Half-Blood. Because, of course, the story gets bigger than that. It's not just Half-Blood. This is sort of the safe space, even if it doesn't feel like it. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.